There is a stretch of open water about 200 miles off the Louisiana coast where nothing breaks the surface except a single drill ship, painted white against blue, holding position over a target no one can see. Ordinary, empty, completely unremarkable. Except 6 miles beneath that drill ship, deeper than most of the ocean floor drops on Earth, something had been sitting untouched for millions of years. And in August 2025, a company most Americans have never heard of drilled straight down to it. That is not the strange part. The strange part is what they found, and how fast the entire offshore oil industry started paying attention. Because beneath the Gulf of America sits something that could quietly reshape one company's future, the exploration strategy of the entire region, and how far America's next decade of oil production actually reaches. Not just another well, a well that finished ahead of schedule, came in under budget, and still managed to surprise the people who study this water for a living. So what exactly did they find down there? And why does an area geologist had already mapped, already drilled, already priced into their models, still have room for a discovery this large? To understand what happened at Daenerys, you have to understand how strange the target was in the first place. Walker Ridge sits in the deepwater Gulf of America, in a stretch of ocean where the water alone is thousands of feet deep before drilling even starts. Talos Energy, the operator, is not one of the giants. It is a mid-sized offshore producer, the kind of company that lives or dies by exploration results, not a household name like Shell or Chevron. In the second quarter of 2025, Talos turned its attention to a prospect it had named Daenerys, sitting in Walker Ridge blocks 106, 107, 150, and 151. Talos held a 27% working interest as operator. The rest was split among a handful of partners, Shell Offshore among them, holding 22.5%. That detail matters more than it sounds. Shell operates roughly 95% of its own production in the Gulf independently. It rarely rides along on someone else's well. When Shell takes a meaningful stake in a prospect, it does not control. It is making a quiet statement about how seriously it takes the geology underneath. Shell was betting on Talos being right. Deepwater exploration is not like drilling on shore. There is no fence to paint green, no wellhead tucked behind a soccer field. A single exploration well in water this deep can cost tens of millions of dollars before a single barrel is confirmed, and there is no guarantee of anything. Seismic surveys can suggest a trap exists. They cannot prove oil is inside it. Companies commit rigs, crews, and months of schedule chasing a formation they can only see as a shadow in the data, thousands of feet below a seafloor that is itself thousands of feet below the surface. Most exploration wells, even carefully modeled ones, come up dry or disappointing. That is the baseline risk every operator accepts before they ever spud a well. It is part of why a mid-sized company like Talos betting heavily on a single prospect carries real weight, and why a major like Shell attaching its name and its capital to someone else's operated well is treated as a signal worth watching. The well was drilled using the West Vela, a deepwater drill ship capable of reaching depths that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, and Daenerys required exactly that kind of reach. The Discovery well went down to a total vertical depth of 33,228 feet. To put that number in terms a person can actually picture, that is deeper than Mount Everest is tall, drilled straight down through rock and water that offers no support, no visibility, and no room for error on a target the company could not see could not touch, and could only infer from seismic data and geologic modeling built up over years. And they hit it, almost exactly where they expected. The well came in roughly 12 days ahead of schedule and about $16 million under budget. In an industry where a single day of delay on a deep-water rig can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, finishing early and under budget is not a footnote. It is a signal that the geologic model Talos built going in was right, and that execution matched the plan almost perfectly. What they found waiting at the bottom was oil pay across multiple high-quality, subsalt Miocene sands, rock layers formed tens of millions of years ago, buried beneath a shifting canopy of salt that has moved and folded for millions of years since, hiding and trapping hydrocarbons in pockets that are notoriously difficult to locate and even harder to reach. This is the same basic geological trick that built Spindletop in Texas more than a century ago. Salt behaving strangely under pressure and creating pockets where oil concentrates. Except here, that trick is happening beneath thousands of feet of open ocean instead of a hill outside Beaumont. And it took a drill ship instead of a wooden derrick to prove it was real. The Gulf's salt canopy is not a thin layer. In places, it is thousands of feet thick, shifting and deforming over geologic time like something closer to a slow-moving glacier than solid rock. That movement folds the layers beneath it into shapes nobody can predict just by looking at a map. Two prospects sitting a few miles apart can have completely different odds of holding oil, because the salt above them moved differently millions of years ago. It is part of why so much offshore exploration still comes down to educated, expensive guesses, even with modern seismic imaging. The company ran a comprehensive wireline program after the strike, pulling core samples, fluid data, and log data to actually characterize what they had found, rather than simply celebrating a discovery and moving on. Then, to preserve the well's future value, Talos temporarily suspended it, rather than immediately pushing toward production. They were not walking away. They were pausing on purpose. So, how big is this really? Talos has not released official volume figures, but Wood Mackenzie, one of the most closely watched energy research firms in the world, called Daenerys a genuine game-changer for the company. Their analysis suggested the discovery could add more than 50 million barrels of oil equivalent in net proved reserves, an increase of more than 25% over Talos's entire proved reserve base at the end of 2024. One well, one quarter. A 25% increase in what the company had spent decades building. Wood Mackenzie noted this is the largest discovery in Talos's history in the Gulf of America. And if the resource ultimately proves out around 200 million barrels of oil equivalent, which some analysts consider plausible, it would make Daenerys the single biggest Gulf discovery since Shell's whale field back in 2017, the last time a find of this scale rippled through the offshore industry. Preliminary estimates put potential peak production as high as 65,000 barrels per day, though that number depends entirely on what the upcoming appraisal well confirms. Because this story is not finished. It has barely started. Talos is not treating Daenerys as a discovery to celebrate and shelve. It is treating it as a data point that changes how the company sees the entire region around it. Wood Mackenzie's research team pointed out something particularly striking about where Daenerys sits geologically. A nearby field called Bigfoot had already proven that subsalt Miocene sands existed somewhere in the Walker Ridge margin. But Daenerys confirmed that same productive trend extends much further west than anyone had mapped, into territory that industry models previously assumed only held older, different-aged rock formations. In plain terms, the map was wrong, or at least incomplete. And Daenerys is the well that proved it. That kind of revision does not just affect one company's reserve count. It reshapes where every operator in the region starts looking next, especially with a major federal lease sale for Gulf acreage approaching at the end of the year. Companies that had written off certain blocks as unpromising are now taking a second look at what those blocks might actually be sitting on. Lease sales move slowly and quietly, the offshore equivalent of the landmen who once worked county courthouses across Texas, piecing together mineral rights nobody else was paying attention to. A block that looked worthless under one geologic model can look completely different once a neighboring well proves the rock underneath behaves in a way nobody expected. Daenerys did exactly that. Acreage near Walker Ridge that operators might have passed on 6 months ago is now, at minimum, worth a second look. Talos, for its part, is not stopping at Daenerys. The company has 2 additional large exploration prospects already in its pipeline, each with pre-drill resource estimates exceeding 100 million barrels of oil equivalent on their own. Combined with a separate major discovery by BP earlier the same year, 2025 quietly became one of the strongest years for offshore exploration success anywhere in the world since 2020, a fact that got remarkably little attention outside industry circles, given how much oil was actually confirmed to exist. An appraisal well is now planned for the second quarter of 2026, designed to more precisely define exactly how much oil and gas sits in that subsalt trap. Until that well is drilled, every figure attached to Daenerys, the 50 million barrels, the 65,000 barrels a day, the comparison to whale, remains an estimate, informed and carefully modeled, but still unconfirmed. Here is why a single company's reserve count matters far beyond that company. The Gulf of America is not a side character in American oil production. It supplies roughly 13% of all U.S. crude oil, and the federal government forecasts it will average about 1.8 million barrels a day in 2025, a figure the Energy Information Administration expects to hold essentially flat into 2026, only because a wave of new offshore fields is coming online to offset natural decline in the older ones. Almost all of that output, more than 97% of everything produced offshore in U.S. waters, comes from this one body of water. That flatness is doing more work than it looks like on paper. Analysts at Wood Mackenzie project total U.S. oil production will actually decline in 2026 for the first time in years as onshore shale drilling slows. What is expected to soften that decline to keep American output from falling faster is new Gulf production, projects like Shenandoah, Whale, and Ballymore that took years and, in some cases, decades to move from discovery to first oil. Daenerys is not on that production list yet. It is years away from producing anything. But it is exactly the kind of discovery that eventually becomes one of those names. One more field standing between flat national output and a steeper decline. A basin producing 13% of the country's oil finding a new productive trend nobody had mapped is not a rounding error. It is the difference between the Gulf holding its ground for another decade and the Gulf slowly running out of new places to look. That is also why the timing next to a major federal lease sale is not incidental. Companies do not bid blind. They bid based on which blocks the latest wells suggest are worth the risk. A discovery that redraws where the productive rock actually sits does not just help Talos. It resets the odds for every company deciding where to spend hundreds of millions of dollars over the next several years, in the one offshore region still capable of adding meaningful barrels to the national total. The drillship has since moved on. The Daenerys wellhead sits quietly suspended, exactly where the company wants it, beneath thousands of feet of Gulf water that looks, from the surface, like nothing at all. No derrick, no gusher, no forest of steel breaking the horizon the way Spindletop once did. Just a single point on a map that used to be considered geologically unremarkable, that turned out to be sitting on top of one of the most consequential offshore oil discoveries in years. The Gulf of America has been drilled, mapped, and modeled for the better part of a century. Companies have spent decades convincing themselves they understood exactly where the oil was and where it wasn't. Daenerys is a reminder that even in a basin this thoroughly studied, the map still has room to be wrong. Somewhere else out there, in water that looks just as empty and unremarkable as it did over Walker Ridge, there may be another pocket sitting exactly where nobody thought to look. The only question, as always, is whether anyone drills in the right direction to find it.